Go. We should be recording. So welcome everybody. I am Brian Vanderwend. For those who haven't been in one of my training sessions before, I'm a member of CISL's Consulting Services. And today I'm going to just kind of briefly go over some of the changes that have happened with our Globus service support at NCAR in the past 2 days, as we've migrated from version 4 of the Globus backend server to version 5. And version 5 brings some exciting new changes that we've wanted to deploy for quite some time. We've just been waiting for the Globus folks to provide us with a migration path that sort of simplifies some of the stuff in terms of what you all as end users will need to accommodate. So basically, we wanted to make sure that we could transition the existing endpoints to be the new Globus version 5 collections without disrupting workflows. And I'll explain more what that means as we go forward. So the intended audience for this talk is generally people who are going to be familiar with using Globus already. But certainly if you have any questions at any level, feel free to put them in the chat or just go ahead and unmute or raise your hand, or however you'd like to bring to get my attention, and I'm happy to answer them. So moving forward, just to briefly review the Globus services that we provide in CISL, there's a number of different capabilities that we support. The most fundamental, and this is sort of the existing picture that was in place up through last week. To that point, we provided a number of storage endpoints. These are, in the old terminology, these are referred to as host endpoints. Those would be things like NCAR Glade, NCAR campaign storage. We had an endpoint for Quasar, the tape file system, as well as 2 S3 Globus connectors, one for our on-prem Stratus object store, and then also one that would go out to AWS. And then there was also an endpoint for our data sharing service, which I show over here. So the data sharing service, for those who weren't active users, it's basically a space that we would provide on request or by request for users. This would be a small, relatively small space in Glade P data share. It was per user, and basically that was a space that you could put data. It would temporarily be stored for a short period of time, and then you could create a shared endpoint. Basically, this is a user managed endpoint that you could then set access permissions on, so that you could share data to external collaborators without having to do authentication or have an NCAR account. And that concept will certainly be expanded upon in version 5, and it's one of the reasons that version 5 is exciting. Eventually, we did also enable that capability to share data directly from campaign storage spaces. So that sort of reduced the need, I would say, for the data sharing service, but we do still have plenty of folks who have used that. And those spaces are still on the file system right now. So this isn't something that is necessarily going away yet, but I'll get into that more in a slide or two. And then we also provided some capabilities to support unattended workflows with Globus. And this was particularly important when we initially deployed campaign storage, and that sort of became I wouldn't say a replacement because the intention is different, but the next evolution of data store, like longer term data storage, once we retired the HPSS tape archive. Because initially the campaign storage was only accessible via Globus. It wasn't accessible via a POSIX interface at the time. Obviously that's changed, so the need for this is lessened, but there are still folks certainly who are using unattended workflows to migrate data either to like divisional clusters or even just between the file systems, because it's a convenient scripting mechanism to do so. So in the existing way to authenticate endpoints, you could set a max lifetime on your authentication, and that would go up to 30 days, but there wasn't really a good way to ensure that a workflow wouldn't break after a period of time. So what we developed was this process where we could grant you an in-common certificate that you could store in your home directory, and basically provide a bunch of utilities to then authenticate that certificate on demand whenever you wanted to run a transfer. This was a utility called GCI, and there was another one called GCert. These were sort of trying to be analogous utilities to like HSI and HTAR for people who are familiar with HPSS. But this capability, you know, it worked, but we've seen recently like these certificates do expire after a few years, and there were definite downsides to this. So this is also going to change, as we'll show. All these services were available through multiple interfaces. You know, these are different APIs built upon the fundamental like Globus Python API. The web interface is, I would say, the most featureful and the most used, but certainly for something like the unattended workflows, you're probably more likely using the Globus CLI, which is just a Python package, or you're using the basic API calls in something, an app that you've written. For the CLI, if you haven't used it, that's available in the default environment on the data access nodes, but it can also be accessed very easily on any of the other resources like on Cheyenne or Casper, just by loading up our NCAR package library in Python. Or it can easily be installed in your own cond environment, of course. So what has changed in version 5 of Globus? So one of the big changes, I mean, it's not really a big change in terms of use, but it's a big change in terms of understanding, is the terminology. And they've sort of been migrating to this newer terminology for a while. You've probably noticed in like the web UI and some other places. But the big thing now is that when you do transfers, you will interact with collections rather than endpoints. There still are endpoints on the back end. And if you are transferring to any site that's still running the version 4 endpoints, they will in fact be host endpoints still. But for us, for things like NCAR Glade and NCAR campaign storage and all of that, those are now collections. And indeed, the shared endpoints that people have created on our systems are also collections. These are two different types. So we have a mapped collection. This is something that is managed by the site. So, in our case, we manage these collections. And they point to, essentially a collection of files that are hosted on an endpoint. So now NCAR Glade, instead of being a host endpoint, is a mapped collection, but it basically functions the same way. And it provides access in the same manner. And this is one of the reasons we waited for this migration path to be present, is we ensured that it has the same IDs as well. So if you use like a UUID to reference an endpoint like NCAR Glade, it should be the same UUID, even though it's now a mapped collection. And it has the same name. So there shouldn't be too many functional differences there, but it's just something to be aware of. If you see like collection, don't be confused. And similarly, there's now this concept of a guest collection, and this is a user-created subset of files that reside on a mapped collection. So you create a guest collection from a part of a mapped collection that you have POSIX permissions, or if it's a bucket, you have permissions to access. And it has distinct sharing permissions from, say, on the mapped collection. So it functions very similarly to the old shared endpoints. In fact, I would say it's the natural evolution of those, but there are more capabilities now. Probably the most noticeable change as you interact with version 5 is the authentication. So, the old form we use on the version 4, we used my proxy authentication. And this is what enabled that in common certificate pathway as well. Basically, that was a stand-in for the my proxy authentication. So now in version 5, they've moved to an OAuth based approach. This, that's sort of on the back end. On the front end, what you'll see is now you link an identity to a mapped collection. And then you basically tell Globus that you give consent for that collection to basically for the app, whether it's the website or the Globus CLI, you give it consent to access your data on that map collection. This is something you have to set up once, and then it should be in place for you, moving forward. Which isn't to say that you don't have to re-authenticate like a mapped collection. There still has that 30-day limitation for the lifespan of your authentication, but the guest collections help us get around that for unattended workflows, and I'll explain that a little bit more moving forward. So if I return to this view, how do those changes affect the usage at NCAR? So, again, these host endpoints are now mapped collections, but they have the same names and the same UUIDs. So the main difference here, if you're just a user that wants to, use, say, our storage collections to do transfers, it's really just an authentication process difference. But otherwise, the usage should be very similar. Now, in terms of the data sharing and the unattended workflows, this is where we see more changes. So the data sharing is now a lot more flexible. And this is why the data sharing service as it was is now deprecated. So before, it was campaign storage and it was the DSS spaces in Glade P that could be shared from and that's where you could create shared endpoints. But now most storage spaces that we provide access to allow you to create a guest collection, and a guest collection allows you to share data with with whoever you like. The permissions model, it basically layers Globus access on top of whatever the native POSIX permissions are. So if you, if a file has the proper, read access for you to share it, and then you decide to share it with people via the Globus permissions, then it has that 2-layer permission process. The really cool thing about this new sharing method is that you can use it to create URLs to files on a storage system. And you have to set up the permissions on your guest collection a certain way to do that, and we'll show. But basically, this would allow for like DOI requirements, or if you have shared data for reproducibility, or you just want to make it convenient for somebody to get data from Glade, for example, to an external collaborator without having to even use Globus. You can now do that by creating a URL and share that URL just by sending it. So that's pretty neat. And that's something that I know people have been interested in for a while, and it's why we wanted to migrate to version 5. We just needed to wait for it to be ready. And then in terms of unattended workflows, instead of doing the in-common certificates, what we will do now is basically have folks create guest collections for whatever desired spaces they want to use in the unattended workflow. So if you have a directory in, say, your workspace in Glade or something on campaign storage, you would create a guest collection that points to that. And once you create it, it basically grants you open access to the data via that guest collection. And you would use that guest collection in your calls in the CLI or the API instead of using our mapped collections. And that essentially bypasses the authentication process. Obviously, you'll have to authenticate to create the guest collection, but then once it's created, you don't have to authenticate again to use it. So this sort of provides a more I would say native way to do the unattended workflows via Globus. One thing that's very important to note is that because these new mapped collections don't use my proxy authentication anymore, the in-common certificates that we've deployed, they no longer work. That's just that's a byproduct of the authentication. There was no the migration. There was no dual authentication option for us to deploy. It's either my proxy or it's the new OIDC authentication. So you will unfortunately have to migrate your unattended workflows to this new process. But from what we've seen, it should be like one initial bit of transition pain, and then I think the process is better moving forward. So in these slides, I just have some screenshots, and I'll go through this live as well, but this will be available in a PDF version for you to reference in the future. It's relatively simple, but the authentication part is probably the trickiest thing in the new in the new updated collections. So when you first authenticate to one of our mapped collections, you'll get this screen. This is nothing strange in the file manager and the web API, for example. You'll be asked to consent. So you click continue, and then it will say, well, we need you to link an identity and then consent via that identity. So what you will click is this link an identity from NCAR OIDC. And that'll basically take you to a screen where you can then use your HPC account from Cheyenne or Casper to perform the authentication. This is, again, like a one-time setup step to give the consent. So this linking, you should only have to do one time. And you'll notice that once you do this with one of the collections, that identity will show up as an option. So then you can just click that one, and you won't have to necessarily, like it's not really a big convenience because clicking these two things sort of takes you to the same step. But just something to be aware of when when you see this other identity show up, it's just indicative of that you've done it once already. And I guess I should mention that this is true for each mapped collection. It's a bit annoying, but if you consent to let the NCAR Glade collection use your identity and provide access to your data, you'll have to do the same thing for like NCAR campaign storage and NCAR Quasar and whatever endpoint you want to use. You have to do it once for each mapped collection. I keep saying endpoint because it's such a force of habit. So when you click that OIDC link, it will take you to this screen where you'll put in your username and your CIT passwords for duo authentication. So that's fairly standard. And then once you do that, then you'll be taken to this page where basically this is where it's telling you, if you're familiar with other OAuth systems, like any phone apps and things like that, they'll ask for various consents. In this case, it's telling you that the Globus web app is wanting to access your data via HTTPS, manage your data on NCAR Glade, manage your data using Globus transfers, and then also manage collections on, this is because sort of the endpoint it underlies the NCAR Glade map collection. So all of these things are required. So you can just click allow and consent for the Globus web app to use this collection. And once you do that, you should be set up. It should be ready to go. So at that point, you can use it as you were using the old NCAR Glade endpoint before. And then also for reference, I just want to show how to create a guest collection. So this is something, and we were a little unsure as to exactly how this process would look, actually until this morning, because it was looking like it might be an opt-in thing where we'd have to give you privileges to share data via a guest collection. But it turns out that actually anybody who has access to the map collection can create a guest collection. So this is nice. It means that we don't have to go back and forth with you to enable your account to do this. You should just be able to do this right out of the gate. And anybody can create a guest collection on anywhere you have access to on Glade or on campaign storage. So this should be a nice convenience, I think, for everybody. But basically, it works similarly to if you did create a shared endpoint before, it works similarly to that. So for example, in the web interface, you would go to a directory you want to share. Like here, I have this paper data directory. You would click the share button. It would take you to another screen, and then you would click add a guest collection. This will be a button on the other screen. Once you click that, it takes you to this screen and it tells you that, hey, you're creating a guest collection that's on NCAR Glade. So it's on that mapped collection and you're going to share data with that. So then you can, it shows you the directory you want. You could, of course, change that. You want to give it a display name. So that's something that people can search. This is maybe a bit long, but at least it's unique. And then, maybe give it a description if it's something that you are using, again, to share data. And then you just have to create collection. And once you do that, then you will have the endpoint with the name, or sorry, the guest collection with the name, and with a UUID that you could use in either the Python API or the CLI. And then the other thing that you will probably want to do, this is why guest collections are pretty neat, is you can then go and manage the permissions via this guest collection. So this is just another screen. And again, I'll show this live in the web interface in a moment. But if I go into the permission screen here, I have various options for what I can do. If I want to just share everything, then I can do that. Or you can, obviously share like a subset, a specific directory or specific path in that guest collection. But here I'm just going to share everything. And I could share it with a particular user in Globus or a particular group in Globus. I could share it with all users in Globus, or I can do a public anonymous share. So make data accessible to everyone. And that public sharing is, it's particularly useful for creating the direct URLs to files. So if I basically gave anybody read access to my data, and then went back into the web interface and created URLs to those, once I give those URLs to people, then they can, access it without having to interact with Globus at all. Obviously, Globus is doing things on the back end, but they don't see that. Whereas if you were to share it with all Globus users and then created a URL, they would still have to, then go to the Globus web interface. And it gives you a little detail on, what this means when you're going through the selections. One thing we always like to point out and emphasize is to, in Globus, avoid write permissions on your data unless it's really justified. This is especially true, when you're dealing with guest collections that could be anywhere, in like campaign storage or in your work directory or your home, because obviously if you give write permissions, then anybody who has access to that endpoint, or anybody who finds that endpoint, if it's all, or guest collection, if it's all users, then they could erase data, and you obviously don't want that. So think about your data integrity, and there's a reason that this isn't on by default. Think about it if you have good cause to actually check that dangerous write button. But once you add that permission, then it's ready to go, and then you can use this to share data. Or again, without changing permissions at all, the guest collection should be set up for you to do unauthenticated work with that guest collection as the creating user. So that's how you would go about doing an unattended workflow. One thing to note is that if you use our mapped collections in the CLI, that also requires linking an identity and giving consent to access data. So when you do it via the CLI, if like, let's say you do a Globus LS on NCAR Glade, or you try to submit a transfer. The first time you do that, you're going to get a message that looks something like this. So it'll say the collection you're trying to access data on requires you to grant consent for the CLI to access it. And then it will give you, and I've clipped this because it's a very long command, but it will give you this command that you need to run, and that'll take you to an authentication page in a browser. So you will need to go into a browser to do this. And then it'll give you a one-time code that you put in to give consent. So it's the same basic thing. This is something you have to do once for each mapped collection, but then you shouldn't have to do it again in terms of giving consent. And even if you give all the consents in the web interface, you will probably still need to perform this one-time consent in the CLI too. And I'm thinking as well in any custom Python APIs that you've written. So, that's just something to be mindful of. If you, let's say, for example, if you're creating a workflow, the first time that you run this, you're going to have this extra step. So it's probably something you want to do manually the first time before running in any sort of script. But again, in a script, generally, you would use a guest collection because that's not going to require authentication anyway. There are definitely some limitations with the Globus CLI compared to the web UI when we think about version 5. These aren't deal breakers, but they're just things to be aware of. So in terms of guest collections, they can be queried and managed in the CLI, but currently, as far as I could tell, they can only be created in the web interface. So if you want to go, and create a guest collection, you basically, I think you need to follow those steps that I showed before. There doesn't seem to be the command infrastructure in the CLI yet to create a guest collection. So it's, it's a one-time thing. It shouldn't be a big limitation, but just something to be aware of. And in terms of terminology, this is a bit confusing. So endpoint and collection are, I'd say, intermingled in the CLI commands, and I'm sure that's because of the legacy aspect of the CLI, and they don't want to break people's workflows. But if you are looking to find the UUID, the identifier of a collection, you would still use Globus endpoint search. There's no you wouldn't use Globus collection search or something like that to get the UUID to use in a transfer. So it's just something to be aware of. In some respects, that makes it easier to migrate, but it can be a little bit confusing. And then the other thing that's a bit confusing as well is for those who have used these commands, to search for our collections, in the past, you would have been able to do Globus endpoint search, filter, and then use this filter owner ID flag and give NCAR at globusid.org, and then a search string, and that would show all of the ones that we deploy. It now seems like you'll want to run instead Globus endpoint search, and then just give our owner ID here, this NCAR at globusid.org, as the search string. I'm not sure why that's the case. It seems a bit confusing, but that will give you the endpoints, or the mapped collections that we provide, whereas this version will give you something else. So that's just something to be aware of. Before we go into the bottom line, I think I will do some demo here, and let's go out of here. And let's go to the Globus page. So if I log in, and I'm going to show the web interface first. So if I log in, it's got my Globus ID cached, so I didn't have to do any sort of Globus login there. But if I go in here and I search for, we can search for NCAR Glade. Now I've already authenticated, but if I go down into collections, we can see now that this says it's a managed map collection instead of being a host endpoint. And if I click on this, I can get some details. So, again, we can see the display name here. And then this UUID should be the same UUID that you used before. So this should hopefully not incur any changes in your workflow. And you can actually manage your consents, in this screen. So like this shows all the consents I've given. You can manage the data, manage data using the Globus transfer. And you can obviously delete these consents if for some reason you want to revoke them. But just, be aware that that will then break some things and you'll need to reconsent if you want to use that. So I think that's probably unlikely that you'll want to do that, very much. So if we go back into the file manager here, I can show briefly how we would share something. So let's see, I'll go into my tutorials, and if I wanted to share my Globus v5 directory here, I could select it. I can click share. It takes me to this screen and it shows the guest collections that I've created already, including that cool climate journal data that I showed in the screenshots. And then you would just click add a guest collection to then get to this screen where I could then give it a display name and basically create the collection. This should be available to do anywhere that you have access to on Glade or Campaign Storage, or our other endpoints, for example. And if I click permissions on this one, I can see what I've given permissions to. By default, obviously, your personal identity will have read and write permissions. So that's, again, how you would enable the unattended workflow. But again, if I go in here, I could give all users access, or I could even do public anonymous access to that directory. And then one other thing I'll show in here. So if we go back to this screen, and let's go in here to, say, paper data, and select a file. If I click this file and then click get link, this is where you can get a URL, a direct URL to that file. And you can actually get a URL to the path in the file manager, or you can get the direct URL to the file, and this bypasses the Globus interface entirely. So again, I would want to do this in my guest collection. But that's how you would do that in the web interface. Looks like I do have a chat question. So in guest collections, if you give permissions to a group, What group is that? A Globus group? Yes, so that's not going to be like a POSIX group. That'll be a Globus group that you can define in this group section. I could go in here and create a new group and add various collaborators if I know their Globus IDs. So that's what they mean by group there. Thanks for the question. Let's see. Okay, yeah, thank you. So the other thing I'll show just briefly, since I know we sort of advertised this as being a half hour, though we've got time for plenty of questions if others come up. But I just want to show in the CLI. So, here I've got a terminal session on Cheyenne. And again, if I want to use Globus, I can just do a module conda. I can do conda activate NPL, so to start up our NCAR package library in Python. And now I should have access to the Globus CLI command. Again, if I do a Globus endpoint search on NCAR at globusid.org, this should, yes, so this should show all of our endpoints that we provide. And obviously there's some testing endpoints that are still lingering around in here, but these are the main ones. These are our production endpoints currently. And again, if you just search for our owner ID, that will give the endpoints that you would want to use from us. If you just were to search for NCAR Glade, just as a point of comparison, you'll get some other ones that perhaps aren't owned by us. So this is a way that you can filter to make sure that you're getting like the actual NCAR Glade endpoint. They don't have any sort of name collision in there, which I guess is probably good given the number of people that use Globus at different sites, but obviously it can lead to some confusion as well. The other thing to note is if you're on Cheyenne or Casper, you can get these endpoint IDs directly from our modules. So if you have the NCAR ENV module loaded, it will place these in your environment. And if you look for NCAR Globus, you'll see that these are all defined as environment variables. So you could just reference those directly. And if I were to do, say, Globus LS, NCAR Globus Glade, then it should give us a listing of our home directory. That's where you'd start on the Glade endpoint. So this should hopefully provide just a little bit of convenience. But again, you'll notice that I'm for the searching, for example, I'm using that Globus endpoint command. So it's a bit confusing, but you are using a mapped collection, not an endpoint in the new terminology. I think that's all we probably need to show in the CLI. Again, usage shouldn't be that different. And the thing to note, again, is if you're doing an unattended workflow, instead of doing anything with my proxy or that GCI command or the GCert command, what you'll instead do is you'll create a guest collection. You'll get the UUID here of, instead of one of our collections or one of our map collections, you'll get it of your guest collection. And then you'll use that in your transfers, and you can just use the the native Globus transfer, and use your UUIDs for your guest collection. And then you shouldn't have to do any sort of authentication once that's all set up. And that should persist for as long as this infrastructure is in place and until I guess Globus version 6 comes out. So we anticipate that should be a pretty stable workflow for people and hopefully easier to set up. So let's see. I guess the last thing I will point out here before I take questions is that we have updated our documentation as well. So if you go to arc.ucar.edu and then you search for Globus, there is still a bit of a mix of the old and the new documentation. But for example, if I were to go to data transfers and sharing, oops, that's not the right one. Yeah, sharing data and making unattended transfers. This is our documentation in a more written form for creating guest collections and using those either in unattended workflows or using them to create a URL to access files. So, this gives a bit more reference, and obviously all those CLI commands are documented by the Globus folks as well. So if you're new to the CLI, you can use that to get spun up. But obviously, we're just coming out of this migration. There's some changes that people need to adapt to, and we are happy to provide support for folks as needed. And sort of along those lines, the bottom line here for different workflows. So if you're just a user of the old NCAR host endpoints to do transfers, you'll have a new authentication method, but otherwise no real changes. So collections will keep the same name and the UUIDs. If you are a user of the data sharing service, then the existing shared endpoints that you've created have become guest collections. They've been migrated as well. They'll have the same name, they'll have the same UUIDs, so it shouldn't break anything. They'll just have a new descriptor, I guess, will be the guest collections. If you're a new user, or at least a new user to sharing in Globus, basically you'll create a guest collection directly on your work or your Scratch or your campaign, wherever you think is appropriate, rather than us providing a space in this Glade P data share. If you already have a data sharing space and you need to create a new guest collection, you can do it from that space as well, but don't think of them as shared endpoints anymore, even though it's fundamentally very similar. If you do unattended transfers, then that myProxy-based in-common certificate approach it's no longer valid. And that GCI command and the GCERT command, they've been retired. You'll see a banner message if you try to use them at this point. So you'll need to switch those guest collections with open access for the owner. So again, it'll still require a Globus login, but it won't require any OIDC authentication to our mapped collections. So fundamentally, it'll be an unattended workflow. And then this is the new capability. Again, if you're a data publisher, you have this new URL sharing, so you can provide direct access to files. Now, obviously, it's still incumbent upon you to make sure that that data persists on the storage system. So I wouldn't necessarily provide a URL to data on Scratch, for example, because it will eventually get purged off the system. But if you want to share something more longer term, maybe you have something on campaign storage and it's going to be there for a few years, that could help fulfill some data sharing requirements that you might have for publication or something like that, or just to encourage collaboration. So that said, that's all the content I have, but I just want to point out, as always, if you need further assistance, you can go to this Getting Help page, or go to rchelp.ucar.edu to submit a ticket. We are now in blue phase again here at NCAR, so number of people in the office is probably not as high as it used to be on any given day, but you are welcome to walk in and see if somebody's in our suite to give one-on-one consulting. Might be better to schedule that ahead of time though. And that's the phone number for the help desk as well. And if you have specific questions from today, or if you have any feedback for me, feel free to email me directly, and I'm happy to work with you on that. With that said, I think we'll take any other questions that people have. Either feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. And otherwise, thanks for your attention. And obviously we have recorded this, and the slides will be provided in PDF format, probably in a few days once that all gets processed and uploaded. So you'll have this for your reference. And I guess if you don't have any questions, feel free to hop off and have a good rest of your day. Okay, so Dom says, the Globus V5 compatible with older endpoints? No, that's definitely not a dumb question at all. And I think that they've made that a bit confusing, just because of, it's like, well, there's this terminology change and the interface has changed a little bit, but To answer your question, though, it's compatible in the sense that you can certainly do transfers between our v5 collections and other sites that are still running v4 endpoints. The transfer protocol should treat those equivalently. So if one side is running the old stuff and one side's running the new stuff, that should be totally fine. Obviously, at the other sites, if you may not be able to create like a guest collection and do that URL sharing and use some of those new features, but the fundamental transfer should still work. All right, well, it looks like I don't think any other questions are coming in, but if anything does come up and it comes to mind after the fact or whatever, feel free to contact me via that email. And I think we'll go ahead and I will turn off this recording. So stop recording.